In his essay entitled Structure, Sign, and Play, Jacques Derrida refers prominently to the concept of bricolage, the constructive reuse of discursive elements. According to Derrida, although discursive movements such as philosophical schools set as their primary goal the task of deconstructing and rejecting the work of previous movements, they fail to escape the semiotic frameworks established by their forebears. Thus, for example, a philosopher critiquing Platonism tends to create an alternative that relies on some of the same structural elements and oppositions as Platonism did. Even if the new philosophical movement advances arguments that are opposite those of Platonism, this very opposition is what ties the new movement inextricably to its rejected predecessor. Derrida notes that one possible strategy for dealing with this fact is bricolage. This involves finding new, adaptive uses for the discursive element that one, quote, finds at his disposition around him, those which are already there, which had not been especially conceived with an eye to the operation for which they are to be used, and to which one tries by trial and error to adapt them. End quote. In order to help solidify my understanding of the difficult concept of bricolage, I have gathered and commented on photographs and on musical clips that help illustrate or analogize this concept. This photograph depicts the wall of an Anglo-Saxon tomb, in which stones from an earlier Roman fort have been redeposited. The photograph brings to mind the metaphor that etymologically underlies the word bricolage, namely the metaphor of bricks from a collapsed building being used to construct a new building. This picture shows the Pantheon in Rome, which was built as a pagan temple but was subsequently converted into a Catholic church. It does not seem at first glance to offer an ideal analogy to bricolage, because the building itself was left intact, rather than being dismantled and adaptively rebuilt in an alternative, more church-like form. Nevertheless, on more of an intangible, ideological level, this is exactly what gives the Pantheon its power as an example of symbolic bricolage. The act of converting the intact building into a house of Christian worship may have served as a deliberate semiotic strategy designed to signify Christianity's supersession of ancient Roman polytheism. This form of bricolage is, perhaps, more ideologically potent than the forms Derrida discusses in Structure, Sign, and Play. Derrida discusses cases in which the bricoleur hides his or her work, feigning genuine originality. To this effect, he writes, "The notion of the engineer who supposedly breaks with all forms of bricolage is therefore a theological idea." Later in the same paragraph, Derrida continues, "The odds are that the engineer is a myth produced by the bricoleur." End quote. It is interesting to note that in the case of the Pantheon, bricolage is apparently advertised for theological purposes, not obscured as in the cases discussed by Derrida. Bricolage is also a relevant concept in the fine arts. An example of bricolage in visual art is collage. As in the previously discussed example, collages tend to advertise the fact that they are formed through bricolage, combining and adapting images from different sources, rather than masquerading as unitary, indivisible works of art. Similarly, the history of orchestral music over the past few centuries has been characterized by bricolage in a very important way. Composers have had to reuse more or less the same instruments, organized in fundamentally similar harmonic arrangements, while creating radically different musical effects. Compare, for example, the following two orchestral excerpts, the first of which is by Mozart, the second by Shostakovich. The stark contrast between these two pieces, coupled with the fact that they are played by many of the same instruments, more directly illustrates the concept of bricolage as it is discussed by Derrida. While 20th century composers often aimed to create truly original music in reaction to earlier styles, they were unable simply to abandon the framework established by previous musicians and composers. As a result, they created new music that relied on the elements of this pre-established framework. As these examples illustrate, Derrida's concept of bricolage is not only relevant to the history of social theory. It is a fundamental aspect of a variety of different areas of cultural history more generally. It also takes different forms in different contexts. While at times, bricolage does mask itself as creation ex nihilo, in other cases the bricoleur deliberately calls attention to his or her strategic reuse of cultural precedents.